Okay, I think we can get started. I think that we can get started. My name is Mitra Sharafi, and I teach at the law school and at the history department here. I'm a legal historian of the Parsi community. That's my big project right now. And so I am particularly delighted to have our speaker with us today, Mr. Jehangir Patel. Before I give a proper introduction, I'd like to just make one announcement, and this is for the graduate students among you. There's a great opportunity for International Field Research Awards, and it's an award of $3,000 if you get it, to fund exploratory summer field research. Deadline October 15th. So I'm going to pass this pile around. Don't miss this.
You should have gotten it in the bulletin and by email. Perhaps it went to junk mail, but and they come to the center, the application. Right.
Great. So I am delighted to be able to introduce today our speaker, Mr. Jehangir Patel, who is here from Mumbai. He is the editor and publisher of the leading Parsi magazine in India and worldwide, a magazine called Parsiana. And I've brought a couple of issues, 3 of the latest issues, which I will pass around so that you can all take a look. He also teaches at the Xavier Institute of Communications, which is in Mumbai. Now, it's wonderful to have him with us because it's the first time in 27 years, I believe, that he is back in America. He started his journalistic career here in the US. He studied at Yale, and then between 1968 and 1970, I believe, he worked at a number of American newspapers, including the San Francisco Examiner and the Hartford Times. He returned to India in 1970 and started his career there working on a publication called Freedom First with Mr. Meenu Masani, who was the former leader of the Indian opposition in Parliament. He went on to edit and publish newspapers including Kesari Hind and magazines including Opinion, Voyage, which was a travel magazine, and a Diners Club magazine called Signature. Most recently, he has given seminars on paid news at the Indian Center for Cultural Freedom, and he's given seminars on minority journalistic coverage in Delhi under the auspices of the Indian International Center. I've known Mr. Patel since 2003 when I began my PhD research, and ever since then I learned very quickly that whenever I go to Mumbai, top of my list has to be a visit to the Parsiana office so that I can meet with him and get all the news. I find he has his finger on the pulse of everything that's happening in the Parsi community and also everything that's happening in Mumbai and nationally. So I always love to get his insights. And today he's going to speak to us about the micro and the macro of Indian journalism. He's going to have a particular focus on journalistic coverage of minority issues in India today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I was asked if I had a PowerPoint presentation, but as a journalist, whenever I'm covering talks, I find PowerPoints very distracting because you listen to the speaker, then you go to the point, then you come back to the speaker, and often you lose track of what's being said. We're exceedingly grateful to Mitra because she's researched 2 of the main Parsi cases at the start of the 20th century that to some extent will define what the community is today. And up till the time Mitra took on the assignment, nobody had really done the kind of research that was required on these 2 cases. And since some of you may not be that familiar with Parsis, I just thought I'd take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the community and these cases. Both these cases pertain to the definition of Parsi. Who is a Parsi? And the first case, which was the Parsi Panchayat case, gave a definition that you had to be born of 2 Parsi parents or at least a Parsi father, or of the Iranian immigrants who came to India in the last 300 years. And the second case, which was in Rangoon and which appeared before the Privy Council, was called Saklat versus Bella, where the Privy Council ruled that even if a trust is created, say like a fire temple, which is where Parsis go to pray, and it says that it is only for Parsi Zoroastrians, the trustees still have a right to admit a non-Parsi Zoroastrian into the premises. So these were 2 very landmark cases. Now, the Parsis probably came to India about 1,000 years ago. The earliest evidence we have would put it at about 1000 BC. Zoroastrianism is, Zoroaster as the prophet is probably dated about 1200 to 1500 BC, sorry, the other figures before Christ. And some people say, some scholars say that Zoroaster didn't exist at all. But the general feeling is all right, whether he existed or he didn't exist, people believe in him today, so he's there for us to see. In Iran, probably the Achaemenians, that is Cyrus and Darius, were Zoroastrians, but there's no specific reference to Zoroaster. There is talk of Mazda and Aura Mazda. And in the Sasanian time, Zoroastrianism was supposed to be the state religion of Iran. Then when the Arab conquest and the Islamic conquest of Iran, the Zoroastrians slowly but surely converted to Islam because of the incentives and other reasons. It is believed, and that's the mythology, that some Zoroastrians left Iran and came to India in boats and settled over there and sought religious refuge. But that probably is not correct. They probably came as traders, and they probably went as traders all over the world. But for some reason, the Zoroastrian diaspora in other parts of the world disappeared. We don't have any Zoroastrian migrant groups that survive till today, or even 200 or 300 years ago. For some reason in India they survived, and I think the reason they survived in India is because of the caste system. In India, people stick with their groups, so the mobility between castes was not that great. And if they came as traders, then they'd be probably down. They weren't the Brahmins, they weren't the priests, they weren't the warriors, they were the traders. And this group stayed in India and basically remained an agricultural group. Nobody really knows much about them. When the Portuguese came to India, then perhaps they did some trading with them. But I think the big break came when the British came to India. I think the British found Hinduism a little complex. There's so many gods and things like that. I think that for the Parsis, it was easier for them to identify because Parsis believed in dualism or monotheism, and then subsequently all the research says, no, it was monotheistic, that Zoroaster sort of saw good and evil, but he wasn't a theologian, so he didn't put it out. But basically, it's a monotheistic religion. So for some reason, the Parsis had fewer restrictions dealing with the British. They were more open, while the Hindus were a little more conservative. So Parsis learned the language, they traded with them. Parsis were, Bombay was the center for opium trade with China. Bombay grew exceedingly wealthy from the opium trade, and the Parsis also, and they almost dominated the trade for a long time. So in about the 1850s or so, the community started to really prosper because you found the largest number of fire temples being constructed around Bombay and Gujarat. They were basically concentrated on the west coast of India, around Bombay and Gujarat. And with this prosperity, they slowly sort of saw themselves as a superior caste, as a group. And so they wanted to keep others out. Then in about 1908, or maybe in 1906 actually, the House of Tatas, I'm sure you've all heard of them, the people who've just bought out the nano car and things like that. One of them, a gentleman called Ratan Tata, married a French lady and had her Naujo, that is, had her initiated into the Zoroastrian religion, and then wrote to the Panchayat saying that she is now a Zoroastrian and I want to take her into the fire temple, and when she dies I want to consign her body to the Towers of Silence. And the Panchayat said no, and this great court case came up where the judges had to decide who was a Parsi and who was not. And finally, one was an English judge and one was a Parsi judge. And the conclusion that came is that when these trusts were founded, the settlers of the trusts had in mind people who were born in the community and not someone who had converted. But over the course of time, since Parsi men had kept non-Parsi mistresses and surreptitiously brought the children into the faith, they said, all right, if a Parsi father is there, then the child can be considered Parsi, but it didn't apply for the women. This was in about 1908. Until today, the ramifications of that judgment are felt because Parsi women's children are not considered Parsis. And a lot of what we focus on in Parsiana evolves around this issue about the rights of women and the women's children. Now, India is a very tolerant country. You read about the skirmishes between the various communities. It basically, like I think Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said somewhere, that we never gone and conquered another country. India's basically remained, people have come and invaded India, but India's never really gone out. There's no Napoleon, no Alexander, anything like that. We just more or less stayed where we were. And it has been an exceedingly tolerant country. If you've got a Sikh prime minister in a country that is predominantly Hindu, and if you have Indira Gandhi was married to a Parsi, so technically her children are Parsi, so Rajiv would be a Parsi also. Though of course they're not Zoroastrians. I don't even know if they consider themselves Hindus, but it's basically a tolerant society, and therefore the Parsis have really prospered in India. We prospered under the British, and we prospered under the Indian government as well. The first Field Marshal, Sam Manekshaw, was a Parsi. Leading lawyers, a US ambassador to, Indian ambassador to, the ambassador from India to the US was a Parsi, Nani Palkewala, after the emergency and things like that. So we've done well in the House of Tatars, even though the British tried to suppress a little bit of industrialization in India because they wanted the industry to be in England and the goods to come back over here. House of Tatars came up, and today probably has the largest capitalization of any company in India. So this is somewhat of the background, and what we are doing is basically covering this community, which is attracts a lot of international attention. Like Mitra came and studied, and so we have scholars from Japan, Europe, Italy, all over coming, wanting to know more about it. And the Indian press also, which has become more aggressive, is also keen about it. But let me just come back. Mitra said I studied and worked over here, and I went back to India in 1970, and I looked for jobs on newspapers there. And the situation was very limited that time, because we were still with the letterpress technology. So if you wanted a newspaper, you had to have very large premises. You had to have very expensive typesetting machines that cost about $700,000. That means probably over $100,000 US. And that machine could only give you maybe about 800 lines in a shift. And you had to have 2 people operating it, and you needed heat, you needed either from gas or electricity to melt the lead, make the thing. So it was very difficult. And when I looked around, at that time I think there was the Times of India, Indian Express, and Free Press Journal. These were the 3 daily papers. The Economic Times had just started. There was a magazine, Femina, which had just started. Illustrated Weekly, which was a very old magazine even from my days in school. And not much else. There was another magazine called Eve's Weekly. Eve's Weekly was very old, but Femina was the later one that came on. So the job possibilities are very limited. And I was told that perhaps I could work on the desk, but I was more keen to work as a reporter, because I'd been working as a reporter both with the San Francisco Examiner and the Hartford Times. And I liked reporting. I didn't want to be stuck to a desk, which basically most media people would like to be reporters. So I met Masani, and he said, look, if you're not doing anything, help me with this paper. Masani had just lost the election in '69. The Swatantra Party, which was sort of a free enterprise party, had been defeated by Indira Gandhi because they formed an alliance without a minimum program, and they were just opportunistic, and they lost. And then Indira Gandhi really came on strong, nationalized the banks, insurance. I mean, insurance was nationalized earlier, but she became a very sort of dominant force in the political scene. And Masani felt that one couldn't fight them politically because she was too strong, but one could, through various institutions, be set up and fight for the causes of free enterprise or whatever else that people valued in those days. I worked with Masani for almost about a year and a half on the magazine, and then I wanted to do something on my own. And I was looking around, and I thought, well, the community is small. There was a daily paper in Gujarati and English, but it wasn't giving any journalistic coverage. And basically, and at that time in 1970, there was no television. Radio was controlled by government entirely. The concept of journalistic story as news didn't really exist. If somebody made a statement, that was reported. If the Prime Minister said something, that was reported. If something occurred, that was reported. But the idea of coverage, of a beat system, of telling a story was quite alien. And a gentleman by the name of Kushwant Singh in the Illustrated Weekly started this trend. And it was very basic, like if you would talk about, say, which was then considered very sort of avant-garde, he talked about the prostitution area in Bombay, which is Kamatipura, and he wrote about it, but the article would start like the first prostitute came in 18-something and go on chronologically. It wasn't coverage, but still that sort of shook up everything. You know, it sort of created a kind of fervor. But the government control on media was extensive because we had what you call a license quota raj. That newsprint was imported. To import newsprint, you had to have a license. License was given by government. So if you asked for, say, so many tons or thousands of tons or millions of tons of newsprint, then the government looked at it and said, okay, we've got scarce resources, we can't give you so much, we'll only give you so much. Then you took that paper and you printed. If your circulation increased or you wanted to increase the number of pages, then you had to go out and buy the paper in the black market. That means buy it from other publishers who imported the paper and weren't using it. So this practice was quite common in those days. I remember for Parsiana also, we used to consume a very small number because at that time we were printing about, I think, 4,000 copies or something. And we'd have to buy paper and then pay for it and then pay an additional amount unofficially to get the paper. And then we would have to go, after having made the payment, and sit at the paper dealer's office and plead with him to send the paper to us. And then we had the blocks, and then the blocks were made from zinc. And then zinc was in short supply. So then we'd have to go to the people who were the dealers in zinc and plead with them to send some sheets of zinc to our block maker, who would then do the thing. And I remember when we started printing in G. Claridge and Company, which was a large printing press, it would take almost 2 weeks to get the galley proofs because the machines were under so much pressure. And then people would go and bribe the foreman to get their galley proofs earlier. So it was a rather sort of a dismal scene. And I just come back from America where, on the papers that I worked in, people were very committed, they were very keen on journalism, they were keen on stories, etc. And I came back over here and I talked to journalists here, I found they weren't really that interested, they were more worried about their pay scales, they were worried about the food in the canteen and things like that. And that feeling of bonhomie and caring just wasn't over there. So when we took on Parsiana in about August 1973, it was brought up by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Pacey Warden. He was a distant relative of ours, and he was a medical doctor, and he brought it out as a love of labor. He was basically doing scholarly articles and things like that, or not journalistic coverage. And when I told him that I was thinking of doing something in the community because it was local and in Bombay, and I thought I could manage it with very limited resources, he said, take on Parsiana. So that's how I took it on. And Parsiana is from that Parsiana, like Victoria Anna, so that's how the ANA comes into it. And when we started doing actual journalistic coverage. So we'd write a story, we'd focus on something, focus on election, talk to people. And for a community that wasn't used to it, it was quite a bit of a shocker that how do we deal with this? Who is this person who is writing about us in a manner sort of not disrespectfully, but without sort of kowtowing to them? It created quite a controversy. It had a lot of impact. And then in about 1975, Indira Gandhi declared the emergency. And it didn't affect us because we were writing on the community and we were more or less free to do what it want. But now the press was even under more pressure. Up till that point, the newsprint quota, most of the major Indian newspapers were controlled by the Marwari community. For some reason, they had the foresight to buy up the papers. So Times of India, the Hindustan Times, Free Press Journal, almost all the major papers were owned by them. And they were in many industries. So the government, if they wanted to turn the screws on them, would deny them licenses in some other industry or not let them expand. In those days, if you wanted to expand your business, you had to get permission from government. If you wanted to get a telephone, it was almost like a 10-year waiting period. And then again, you had to go and use influence to get a phone connection earlier. So everywhere government was controlling. The banks had been nationalized, so loans weren't coming if they wanted to stop that. Government was the major advertiser, insurance, Air India, so many things were nationalized. So without government, you couldn't do too much, and they really had a hole. But from 75 to 77, the hole got even stronger. There was censorship, you couldn't write what you want. And after the emergency was over, Mr. L.K. Advani, who became the Deputy Prime Minister of India much later, and the gentleman responsible for the demolition of the Babri Masjid, made a remark to the journalists in 77 that you were asked to bend and you crawled. And that was true. But that was the state of Indian journalism up to 1977. I think after 1977, things changed. I think people realized after the emergency that this couldn't continue, this shouldn't be allowed to happen again. And then a second major development took place, which was technology. One was from letterpress to offset printing, which was still a very expensive process, so small publications couldn't dream of going into offset. But the two other developments, one was satellite television and the next was desktop publishing. So when desktop publishing came, that changed the scenario overnight. Now, we no longer had to go to these large presses which had these large machines to do the composition. We could do it in our offices. And sort of the publishing came back into the publisher's office when very largely it was kept captive by the printer, and you were at his mercy. As I told you, television started in India in about 1972, and then they would have like 5 hours of English programming in the week and so many hours of Hindi and then Gujarati and Sindhi and all the different languages. And government controlled everything that went on television. Then satellite came, and all of a sudden you had 24-hour stations beaming down to you and giving you maybe 10, 12 stations to select from 24 hours a day, news from CNN and company like that. And I think that the Indian government had no intention of liberalizing the media. Rajiv Gandhi, when he was in America, was asked at one of these conferences when he was prime minister, that what about permitting television and electronic media to be free? And he said, India is not ready for it as yet. So, and prior to that, wire services were all routed through an Indian wire service, which again was a control by the government of India. So then with internet and faxes and all this coming in, all those controls more or less vanished. Now, when we look at the media situation today in India, in Bombay, for example, when I told you we had about 3 newspapers, today we have about 6. We have the Times of India, Indian Express, Free Press, Hindustan Times, Asian Age, and 2 financial papers and 2 afternoon papers. One is, the DNA, it's a new paper that's come out. These papers now are nearly all in color. The old papers are all black and white, they're all in color. They're quite thick. And after China, India has the largest number of papers sold. That means the tonnage is less than the US, because the US, the papers are much thicker. But after China, we are the number 2 country in terms of millions of copies sold. Now, India's population must be close to 1 billion and 20 million or something, 200 million. And the literacy rate would be about 65%. But according to a study done by KPMG and the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce, almost 60% don't have access to a newspaper or a magazine. So you've got a 65% literacy rate, but the people who can get access to newspapers and publications is restricted. And it's my feeling, and it's absolute gut feeling, nothing else, that these people might totally bypass the era of newspapers and magazines and may go just straight into broadband, because to get a newspaper out to these remote villages, the publisher is not interested because the advertising money is not there. And then to have that delivery and take it over there and the delays. So the television reaches them because it doesn't have to, the satellite can reach down there. In these areas, they don't have electricity. And with maybe a little bit of solar heating and things like that, they are able to get some energy going. So I think that these people will become dependent on news from television and broadband and even the mobile phone. The mobile phone is really a tremendously liberating force for India and a great equalizer. People who, as I told you, in the old days, we had to wait 10 years, 15 years to get a phone. Now you can get a phone instantly. And you find everybody from a washerwoman to the fishmonger, everybody, the people selling vegetables, they're all on the mobile phone improving their business. So the mobile telephony is really very big. People still like the newspapers, they still read them, but the surveys that are coming now are showing that the English press is growing at a slower pace than the Hindi is growing very fast. And English is okay, but I think what happened in the old days that advertisers didn't go to the language press because they didn't think that the language press readers had the money. And now it's the other way around. You have people with a lot of money in the agricultural sector because agriculture has become paying. People are selling their land around Delhi and areas and are becoming millionaires because they've sold the land and got a good price. So the situation is changing in terms of the demography of who reads and who does what. The Hindi channels are very popular. They have a larger viewership than the English channels have. The Bombay Gymkhana, which is sort of an upmarket club in Bombay, would always play English music. And then we read in the papers there was a big scuffle because at some disco, the crowd wanted them to play Hindi music and the disc jockey didn't want to play it and there was a big fight about that. So you can see the trend is changing. Even amongst the Parsis at one time they would say that we would ape the British and we would play the violin and play the piano. But today if you see our youngsters, they're all singing Bollywood songs and doing the dances which you see in the Hindi movies. So the trend is changing. About almost 15 or 20 years ago, I don't recall, a leading journalist came to interview me about community publications. So I was quite intrigued because I didn't know other community publications, so I thought maybe once she finishes interviewing me, I could ask her which other publications there were. She finished the whole interview and then she said, okay, now tell me which are the other publications on communities. And I said, I'm not aware of anything, and of course the story never saw the light of day. So for a time, journalism basically was the large newspapers and things like that. It didn't really come down to the smaller sections. But in the last, I think about 10 years or so, that trend is changing. Now the Marwari community, which I said is a very moneyed community and a business community, has a magazine called Marwar. But that basically is focusing on lifestyle. It's focusing on the wealthy Marwaris. It's focusing on their weddings and marriages, and the advertising is all about bridal wear and jewelry and things like that. It's not journalistic coverage of the community. And there's another magazine, I think G2Q, which is about the Gujarati community in India and abroad. And then also it's focusing on them and their exceedingly mercantile community and well-off. So basically these are publishing ventures more to sort of make money, which is fine, but it's not really giving journalistic coverage to that. Then there is the Kutchi community, and we had gone to them for some printing work because the Kutchis have in Bombay almost dominated this desktop publishing. If you want Xeroxing copies or anything, the Kutchis have really cornered this market, and they do it at amazingly low prices. And everybody else has almost been taken out of that production. So a lot of them are into the printing presses. And I found out from this owner of this printing press that he said there were about 350 different castes in Bombay of the Kutchi community. And the caste that he belonged to, they were bringing out a daily paper, 20,000 copies, and only the obituaries were carried free of cost. Anything else you wanted, you had to pay for. So if you wanted to talk about your wedding, or you wanted to talk about a birth, or you wanted to put an announcement, you had to pay for that. And then it would, because the Kutchis have so many printing presses, they do the typesetting in-house, they would use one of their printing presses to print it out. Then they would have about 10 people who would take the papers from the press and distribute it to the areas. And he said there was another Kutchi community that was printing about almost 45,000 copies of a daily paper. And I was really struck. I said that, here the Parsis are always sort of in the forefront, advanced, etc. And we had a daily paper, and it had to become a weekly because we couldn't sustain it. And these people have, with their knowledge of printing and everything else, gone ahead and done it. And out of the sense of solidarity with their community, are bringing out this publication, which breaks even, because on the New Year issue, and in the issues that I think Mitra has given to circulate around, you'll find one thick issue. In our August and March issue, we get the main advertising, and that subsidizes the rest of the issues. So similarly for the Kutchi community, probably maybe Diwali, which is sort of the Hindu New Year, and a few other occasions where you can really get people to give you advertising. So it's breaking even for these people. And my guess is that you're going to find more and more of these community publications coming in. Now, as far as Parsiana goes and the Parsi community goes, in Bombay we don't have any television station, any radio station, and the internet penetration is rather low. Right now internet penetration is low in India because broadband is troublesome, it works, it doesn't work. Then you have to have power, you don't have power, then you've got to have enough money for a computer and everything else. So it still hasn't reached out to people. And I have a feeling that these small publications will be able to reach out where the larger newspapers may or may not, I would think that they will be around for quite some time, but I don't think you're going to see the same growth in that area as you're going to see in this niche market. And I think one requirement is, of course, the community has to be somewhat prosperous to get that advertising, to get the publication going for them. I think the advantage of a community publication, for example, like Parsiana, we become a focal point for anybody who wants information on the community. And for some reason, the international media, as I mentioned earlier, is very interested in the Parsis, as is the local and the national press. So anything happens in our community and all of a sudden it's all over the papers. I was mentioning about, for example, women who marry out. Now there's a small town in Gujarat called Valsad, where the local Anjuman has passed a resolution saying if a woman is married out, and even if she is married under the Special Marriage Act and not given up her religion, she can't enter the fire temple. So now that's become a case in the Ahmedabad High Court. Then the Bombay Parsi Panchayat had a resolution passed that if a woman who's married out wants to have a body consigned to the Towers of Silence when she dies, she must give an affidavit saying that she married under the Special Marriage Act and she continues to profess the Zoroastrian faith. And then about 2 months ago, they passed another resolution saying that we don't know if in the course of her lifetime she may have changed after giving the affidavit. So after she dies, the family has to give another affidavit saying that she continued to practice the Zoroastrian religion. So you can see that there is, for a community that was basically considered broad-minded, westernized, there is a strong tendency to be orthodox. And it's surprising that the Zoroastrians in the UK are probably as orthodox as the Zoroastrians in Bombay or in India, but the Zoroastrians in North America are far more liberal. And in the North American Zoroastrian associations, a spouse who is not a Parsi or a Zoroastrian can become a member. Now, the advantage, I think, of being a community publication and giving journalistic coverage is that we go into the information that the general media is not interested in. For example, in 1973, the first issue we brought out, we focused on the divorce rate. Parsis had about a 10% divorce rate in 1973. And I took a gamble and said this must be the highest divorce rate in India. And it probably was, because at that time, divorces were almost very rare. Women were more likely to kill themselves and commit suicide than go and have a divorce. It just wasn't that accessible. Now the laws have changed. Divorces are easier to get. You have mutual consent and things like that. And you read in the papers every day about how breakdown of compatibility and other things are becoming issues for divorce. So we looked at in 1988, we started collecting data on births, marriages, deaths. And we found in 1988 that 14% of Parsis married outside the faith. Now, for a country like India, that's very high, because forget marrying outside of the faith, you've got to have people marrying within the caste, within the group. Now in Rajasthan, you have another situation where they're saying, no, you can't marry from the same gotra. If you marry from the same community, then they're having honor killings and they're killing these people or banishing them from the place, and now they want to amend the law saying you can't have that marriage, and the government of India is saying, no, you can't amend the law to this effect. People can marry who they want. So from 1988 to about 2010 now, the percent of people marrying out is almost something like 30 to 33%. And I'm sure that's the highest rate in India. And to some extent, that is a sign of integration, that while they're a conservative community, they're willing to look outside. The second point is that it's a very small community. We must be about 85,000 all over the world. In 1940, in the Government of India census, Parsis were 114,000. In the 2000 census, we were 69,601. And in the 2010 census, which has taken place and which the results for the community will come out after almost 4 or 5 years, I think we'll be down to about 60,000, 60 or 62,000. We have about almost 800 to 1,000 deaths in a year, and about maybe 180 to 200 births in a year. So you can see at the rate at which we are diminishing. And maybe about 10 years ago, we were printing about 4,000 copies. Now we're printing just about a little over 3,000. So surprisingly, though, the advertising revenue hasn't fallen, because even though we are a liberal publication and it's basically an orthodox community, people still feel, all right, we will advertise, we will support you because you're a community institution and you're doing something for the community. What people don't like is that if you keep a community story in the community, they're okay with that. But if that community story gets into the general press, they get very upset. Of course, that's changing now, because the general press is taking a lot more interest in the community. And people told us, tell us if something is happening in your community so we can write about it. And I said, well, subscribe to the magazine and you know what's happening. Okay, subscribe to the magazine so you'll know what's happening. And they said, okay, we've been given the beats of minority communities, but we don't have the money to subscribe. So finally what we said, okay, we'll put some of our stories on email, and once the issue comes out, if something is interesting, we'll send it out to the journalists. We did that, and now this affidavit that I told you, the second affidavit that was required, has been written about in the general media. So that puts more pressure on the panchayat and all to reform, because it's hard to be in Bombay, in a cosmopolitan society, and be exceedingly bigoted. It becomes difficult to do that. The Delhi Anjuman is the most liberal in India. Jamshedpur, which is where the Tatars have their iron and steel mills in Bihar, is also, but now not Bihar, I think Jharkhand or Uttarakhand, is also very liberal. So it's not that it's one community that is orthodox, or it's in different factions, depending on the geographic location, the community outlook changes. I think that people often ask me, well, did you miss not going to the general media? Should you have stayed on with the thing? And I said, I'm very happy doing this because you get to cover all aspects of the community and you really get to know it. It's not like when you work on a large newspaper and one day you're covering this, and next day you're covering that, and then you lose track. You're following the story through and you're seeing it year after year. And it has its great rewards. As to what's going to happen to print, I don't know. I was in the hotel and I was reading this Madison magazine where the editor says she worked with newspapers, but now she wasn't subscribing. And then she felt guilty about not subscribing, so she finally got back to subscribing to a newspaper. And she said she was going to subscribe until she got her iPad and the application, and then she's going to stop subscribing. So if journalists don't read newspapers, I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be a difficult time. We have a website, Parsiana.com, but we don't earn any money on it. It's just from the books we sell and things like that. So I really don't know what the source of revenue will be. But just one last point. You would think in a community that has gone almost down by 50% population in 70 years, the publications would dwindle. But as a matter of fact, there's an Orthodox organization called WAPIS, which is the World Association of Parsis, Zoroastrian and Jumans, or something like that, which gives out free every fortnight about 14,000 copies. They print 2 pages in a newspaper and they distribute that newspaper to the community. And the Bombay Parsi Panchayat has started their own monthly magazine. First it was quarterly and biannual. Now it's monthly on art paper in color and distributed to 18,000 homes. So, you know, there's a contradiction. On the one hand, you're going down. On the other hand, print is booming. So let's hope that it works. Okay.
Great, thank you. Time is perfect. So, questions from the audience? Andre.
I sometimes wondered why there was so much mystery about Parsi history. And even the most important developments it's very hard to get a picture of them. I was wondering if you have any idea about, for example, earlier Parsi presence in India, how much bigger it was than it is today. My impression is that it was actually quite big in the 16th century and perhaps earlier. And the second question I also would like to ask is, you always get the impression that there is a thing like orthodoxy for Parsis, but what does that really mean? And is it possible to say that there is a kind of evolution of the Parsi religion and that it perhaps shows changes that are somewhat comparable to changes that are going on in, say, Islam or Hinduism at the same time? Or is it completely immune from those contexts in which it operates?
I think it's not immune. I think what you have in India with, as I mentioned about the Babri Masjid and L.K. Advani, that this thing of Hindu Vatwa, that, you know, that the religion is important, I think that had its impact on the community as well. Because, up to, you know, in about, say, 2005, there was a World Congress, Zoroastrian Congress in the UK, and they were hoping in that meeting to form a world body. They've been talking about a world body from 1961 when the first World Zoroastrian Congress was held. And because of the differences of opinion, it didn't happen. And we thought that in this Congress, finally it was going to happen. But in the meantime, there was already a split in the community. People took more sort of heart in their stand. Maybe it's a factor of globalization, people feel a threat from that, or maybe it's just the undercurrents that are taking place in India itself, the fact of people being more conscious of the religion, people being more defensive, people being more aggressive, it coming into the political field. So it definitely, I think it has affected the community. As I said, the British Zoroastrians are Orthodox, the North Americans are not. They're both democratic countries. And you can't say that, but I think Europe probably is a little more of a rigid society. But in India, definitely the other communities have. And I mean, what other developments have. And I think as for the 16th century, maybe there were, there's not much literature that is known. I mean, there is something in the Portuguese, but unfortunately, since many of us don't read that literature hasn't really come out to know what it is. But basically, we're sort of an agricultural community. We sided with the Gujaratis, lived with them, we adopted their language and everything else. And you don't hear much about the Parsis prior to colonization or the British coming in. You may find something, but by and large, most of the studies seem to indicate they have agricultural and a little bit of trading. But certainly, I don't think in that environment they could have prospered and reached the top. There would have been a lot of pressures on them. I think they probably thought it was safer to stay in their place.
We got a question on the left here.
I'm Kathy Ewing, anthropology. You were talking about circulation, and you also mentioned sort of the last minute this new 2-page art publication and such. It made me wonder, and you may have said this, but I guess I didn't get a clear sense of what the target audience or market is for these two publications, whether it's different, whether there's a kind of diasporic market that your publication has, or is it really locally focused? And then this other one.
Sorry, about 25% of our subscription is overseas, and that's largely in North America, because the largest concentration of Zoroastrians overseas would be in North America, in Canada and the US. In terms of advertising, I think our overseas advertising must be about 3 or 4%. So in a sense, the Indian readers are subsidizing the overseas because the subscription doesn't pay for the cost of the magazine, the advertising does. The Bombay Parsi Panchayat Review and the Vapi's publication is sent free, gratis to everybody. So whether you like it or you don't like it, you get it. In the last election in 2008, the Orthodox sections won. They swept almost the election. So maybe it had an impact, and maybe it was just the feeling of the community that that the group that went out appealing to their Orthodox sentiments were closer to what they believed in. But just from the point of view of anthropology, this Japanese professor of business came down, and he was an anthropologist studying business, so I was a little intrigued with that. And he said, yes, anthropology today was studying more of the modern trends, and therefore he was interested in the Parsis and the Parsi business aspect also, especially Tatas and the house of the nano car and things like that. So one of my professors, when I was studying at Yale, said that all the books on Zoroastrianism that are worthwhile could fill one shelf of a library. And there's nothing more to really research on the subject. But now what people are saying is that the current community is of interest. So let's hope that is the case. So.
We have Don Davis and then Renu and then over the right.
I wanted to ask about the way you represented your work with Parsiana in particular as a journalistic enterprise seems to, you suggest that you're reflecting the evolution within the community and that you're writing about the community specifically. I wonder if you also felt particularly acutely as a community publication or community-focused publication about your role in and almost your responsibility in terms of constantly promoting and continuing particular identities. So rather than the reactive part of journalism, right, the proactive role that you yourself and your staff play in constructing particular visions of Parsiness and the Parsi community and so forth.
Yeah, well, this Orthodox paper, we said our name is Parsiana, and this Orthodox paper said we should be called Parsi Marjana, which means Parsi should die out. So that might answer the question. But in 1988, when we started carrying the demographic details, we started carrying the data of Parsis who married out of the community. And I think that has been the most controversial material that we have carried in the magazine. People hated us. They said that we were encouraging people to get married and that we were just opening the floodgates for the thing, and people stopped subscribing, people stopped advertising, people would just turn their face when we approach. And now I find that's not the case. People didn't realize the percentage was so high. Even now people say it's not so high. But I think maybe our impact, I don't know whether we've changed people's points of view, but I think we've reinforced the points of view of people who thought like us. For example, like take our fire temples. We are burning wood in the fire temple, and people go and put sandalwood and wood, which ecologically is not a very friendly thing to do. So we would write about that, and then people get very upset that why are we talking about this, something is sacred. But then there are a lot of people who feel that, yeah, there should be an alternative to this. And in North America and other places, they have maybe a gas fire which is lit just when people come. while in our fire temples of fires we kept burning 24 hours a day. So I can't really say, I think what we have done is kept the community together. Like people in North America say, look, we're getting Parsiana so we know what's happening, otherwise you wouldn't know what is happening. I think that's the thing, we're basically like a link. And people can write in and give us, and we carry opposing points of view, we carry all the points of view that are there. I think it's, I think that dissemination of information and that shared information is probably what would keep people together. So if they get together in a room, let's say, you know, this happened, that happened. So there's a certain commonality.
This question kind of piggybacks on what Don was asking. How much of this magazine is a political force in the larger community, outside of the Parsi community? Does it have any sort of traction outside in terms of making changes? Or is that not the purpose?
Outside of the community?
Yes.
No, I've got 3,000 circulation in a country of 1 billion something.
In terms of people in power, politicians who are reading the paper and they're keeping an eye on what's going on. What's the
I think, you know, we get about 7-8 subscriptions that go to the central news agency in Delhi, which is then sent to various government departments, but the government departments don't want to subscribe directly. So I'm sure the government of India is keeping an eye on what we are writing because it's a sensitive, being a community thing. But even within the community, I don't know how much our political leaders listen to what we have to say. But if there was an issue of minorities, and this is where the government is always very sensitive, then certainly we would raise a very strong thing. But basically, the government of India has never really threatened the Parsi communities. Within the community, we had more problems from people. But outside, people are very respectful, and people, if there's a case to be made, like this diminishing population and this Khushid, the Ministry for Minority Affairs, wanted to give 10 million rupees towards looking at the population situation. Then they said you can't do it for one community, you have to do it. So there's a lot of sympathy for the community outside. But what we are focusing on basically is community issues. So we don't really focus on the general thing outside. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question or understood it fully. Okay.
Question over here.
My name is Henry Schild, and I studied Indology in the University of Helsinki. There was Asko Karpola, who has studied Vedic texts and the Brahmanical commentaries like Samaveda. Samaveda's commentaries, those Brahmanical early texts, and I came across with the fact that Gatha Avesta is the oldest part of the Parsi religion,
right.
And it's dated to 400 BC approximately. But what is very interesting in this text is that its language is closely related to Vedic, and it is a kind of Iranian version of the Vedic language. And its pantheon, compared to the Vedic pantheon, it's kind of inverted pantheon. Their gods are Ahuras, while in Vedic, Asuras are the demons, and their demons, their demons are Daivas, where in Vedic they are Devas. And the high god is the great Ahura Machna. And that's very interesting. It is a kind of reform of Zarathustra, of that Iranic similar religion as Vedic religion was, Vedic religion. And it is somehow also related directly to Veda, because in Hinduism there is fight between Devas and Asuras. So in the Parsi religion, the Ahuras win, but in Vedic religion, the Devas win. That's very, very interesting. But they were probably two Indo-Aryan tribes which were rivals in the early history or Vedic history, not not Brahmanical. Brahmanical was a little bit later, but during the Vedic period. And what I was just asking about these texts, that which texts do you have? Which text do you refer to in your worship and in your religion?
The Gathas are traced back to Zoroaster, so there are Parsis who say we should be following the Gathas alone.
Yes.
Then there are the subsequent texts and the Avesta, the Palvi, and things like that. And some people say, no, religion is not only of the Gathas, it's all these issues. So there are different schools of thought on it. But if you listen to some of the Avesta prayers, and you listen to some of the Vedic prayers, they sound very similar. And sometimes you think that, this is some priest that is praying a Parsi thing, when actually it turns out to be Vedic. So there are a lot of commonalities between the languages, certain words that are similar. And when you hear the prayers, it does sound similar. But I think most Parsis read the prayers but don't know what they mean. Because then Avesta and the most basic prayer, which is the Ashem Bahu, which every child would learn before they learn anything else, 90% of them wouldn't know what the meaning is. And there was a study done by a gentleman for a PhD on religiosity in Parsi college students, and found that almost 95% of them knew, aside from saying that we are Zoroastrians and we follow the religion of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, really knew nothing more about the religion than that.
I've just got, we're just running out of time. I've just got 2 more questions already lined up. Sorry to move it on. Sana?
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, the view within the Parsi community on the Hindutva movement and Hindu majoritarianism. You said that sort of religion was heightened, the discourse on religion, but in the sense that there was a desire to protect religion, or sort of, the desire to sort of ally with other secular forces. And just yesterday, Rohit Mystery's Such a Long Journey was banned in Bombay University by one of the
Shiv Sena,
would that then be seen as Hindu majoritarianism invading a Parsi space? Of course, Rohit Mystery lives in Canada, and
unfortunately,
does the opposition come as a Parsi opposition or as a more sort of secular minority opposition?
Unfortunately, a lot of the Parsis supported Narendra Modi and said, what he was doing was the right thing, and it was time that these people were put down, the Muslims are put down, and they're riding a high horse and things like that. So a lot of them supported that, even supported. But see, basically the Parsis coming from Iran, and because having Islam coming over there, there's a certain antagonism amongst a lot of Parsis. If you say you're marrying a Hindu, they don't mind. Say marrying a Muslim, they get really worked up. But this was in the past. It's less. But basically the Parsis align closer to the Hindus. And when the Hindus say we have to stand up for our religion, we have to stand up for our rights, and we have to defend it, and we'll fight everybody else, the Parsis also take a cue from that and say, we are going to fight for our rights. We have a right to deny people entry into our fire temples. We have a right to be exclusive. We have all these things. So it's counter, both each side plays on the other to that extent, and reinforces the stereotypes. And Rohit Mystery, it was written almost 20 years ago, I think, that book. And somebody just read it now, presume the grandson of this Thackeray. And they just banned it overnight. The vice chancellor banned the book without consulting the faculty or anybody else. And people who are reading the book and studying it, all of a sudden now have to stop doing it. But this is the reality. I mean, you have strong organizations like the Shiv Sena and the Maharashtra Nivseman, where they resort to violence. So there's always this fear that if we don't do what they're saying, that there'll be problems. And they tell you that we'll do it in our style, which indicates that there'll be sort of gangsterism.
If I can just add a little interesting side point on that. There are a number of cases of Zoroastrians, Parsis seeking asylum in Canada and the UK, arguing that they were under attack, physical attack from the Hindu right. And those claims have been consistently rejected. So the courts of Canada and the UK have said no. Everyone knows that the Hindu right doesn't go after Parsis, and that's not the way that the animosity runs. But it's interesting that that argument has been made. And we have one last question from Hemant. Just time for one.
Just a question about the future of Parsiana and also the community publications in India. There was a lot of training institutes cropping up, journalism training institutes cropping up all over India. Are those young journalists interested in going to community publications?
No. I think In Parsiana, we've been lucky because we've had staff for many years. But the Jame Jamshed had a change of editor, and she was keen to get people to work on the publication, and she's had absolutely no luck. One thing is that even assuming that a journalist, for example, where I teach now, a student who graduates would probably start at something like 15,000 rupees, which in dollars would be about, yeah, probably something like that. Now, even assuming that you are willing to pay 15,000 rupees, the growth A is restricted, plus you're working on a small publication. So I work at Times 7, I work at the Indian Express, you're in the mainstream, and people want to be. So getting community journalists is difficult, very difficult. But this Marwar magazine has been taken on by a large publishing group that also publishes a magazine for Jet Airways. And it's a money-making proposition. So but they're not journalists. I mean, they're basically people who are putting the magazine together, getting something from here. Fashion is very big in India right now. Vogue and all these magazines have come. So there are people who want to come into that, and then as part of a larger organization is all right. But if you talk about a small community publication and people working on that, it's really difficult to get people, very difficult.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.